This is a presentation of our poster, In Pursuit of a Representative Sample, Fielding a Survey Experiment on a Graduate Student Budget. The co-authors are Hannah Korevaar, Rebecca Johnson, and Celeste Marin. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the financial support we received from the Center for Health and Wellbeing Graduate U.S. Healthcare and Health Policy Research Funding Program, as well as a startup grant from the Politics, Research, and Experimental Social Sciences, or PRESS. We also benefited greatly from both the knowledge and the professional networks and connections of Ed Freeland at the Survey Research Center. For students who want to collect their own data, contracting a vendor to conduct an online survey is more feasible and affordable than fielding a survey themselves or conducting a field experiment. But cost increases in direct proportion to academic rigor and credibility of the sample. So, is a representative sample a realistic aspiration for students relying on Princeton student research grants? This presentation describes our attempt to conduct a nationally representative survey experiment using Princeton graduate student grant funding and the alternatives we considered. First, I'll describe the types of samples that are available from commercial vendors that field online surveys. I'll focus on convenience samples, recruited panels, and opt-in panels, which are a kind of hybrid between convenience and recruited samples. Some vendors offer what is called an omnibus survey within a recruited or opt-in panel. An omnibus survey includes questions from a variety of researchers or companies, and you just pay for each question you add. An omnibus survey is carried out regularly, perhaps monthly or quarterly. It's a good way to collect time series data, but it's also an affordable way to ask just a few questions at one time. Probably the easiest and certainly the most well-known way to get an online convenience sample is through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Anyone can sign up to fill out surveys or do similar tasks for very tiny amounts of money. But there are other ways to recruit convenience samples, like through social media or ads on places like Craigslist. Convenience samples are not at all representative, and in fact, they're probably quite biased. But how much this matters depends on your research. Because you can pay very little per response, and there's a very quick turnaround, MTurk can be a useful way to pilot test parts of your survey as you develop it. The flip side of the low cost is that respondents tend not to pay very close attention when they're doing the survey because they're trying to just finish it as quickly as possible. In fact, it's a good practice to have manipulation checks or questions asking respondents about previous questions to be sure that they read the question and intentionally chose an answer. MTurk is fine for undergraduate research, but it's not really suitable for graduate research that you might want to get published. An opt-in panel is one where people volunteer, often in response to advertising, to be on a panel to do surveys in exchange for payment or some sort of credit. Some examples are SSI Research Now, Qualtrics, and YouGov. MTurk isn't technically an opt-in panel, but the difference between MTurk and these panels run by research groups is that respondents on these panels are registered and there is some quality control. For example, if respondents have reports of providing bad data or not completing surveys that they start, they'll get removed from the panel. Their demographic data is on file, so you don't have to ask those questions, and it's possible for the research firm to select a subsample based on these characteristics. For example, if you only want respondents with less than a college education. Although it's possible to weight respondents to make the sample demographically representative, this is still a non-probability sample subject to selection bias. If you're doing a survey experiment where participants are randomly allocated to different treatments, you can still draw some conclusions about the treatment effect, but you can't really say anything about populations. Recruited panels are probability samples. Respondents are recruited from a representative sampling frame, much the same way that they would have been for telephone surveys in the past. They're subject to the same potential biases in that as the telephone surveys, in that a high proportion of those contacted declined to participate, but this is no different than non-response in other types of surveys, so we call it representative. This is really the only sample you should be using if you want to make estimates of population parameters and publish them in respectable journals. So obviously that was our aim. We conducted a conjoint survey experiment. I'll tell you a little bit about it so you have an idea of why we chose the sample we did. It's well established that sexual assault is underreported, and this is particularly true when perpetrators use social or economic forms of coercion, like threatening someone's job or reputation, rather than physical force. But we don't know much about factors that determine which people will report which events as coercion or rape. Our experiment asked respondents to read a series of vignettes where we randomly varied question wording and the specifics of a coercive encounter, the tactic used, and the race and gender of the perpetrator and victim. The complex randomization required that we program the survey directly into Qualtrics and host it there. Omnibus surveys and some recruited panels do not allow questionnaires to be hosted on external platforms. The costs of surveys have been dropping, but you still get what you pay for. This table summarizes the costs for different types of samples. Because their pricing structures might include a base fee, or there might be discounts as a survey gets bigger, I've included surveys of different sample sizes and lengths. Some companies charge by the question and others by the minute. The exact variables depend on the panel, but all panels will include a number of basic demographic variables for free, so you can save a bit there. With MTurk, you set your own fee, so you have some flexibility. We did 2 pilots with a total of about 1,000 participants for around $500. We had $5,000 for our main survey, which could have bought us 5 questions with an omnibus sample of 1,000, but as I explained, our randomization ruled out an omnibus, and we had more than 5 questions. A 10-question survey using the omnibus would have cost $8,250, which was beyond our budget. We had hoped to get a nationally representative sample through a recruited panel, but the minimum quote we got for that was $12,000 to $15,000. There is one other option, which is the time-sharing experiment for social sciences, or TESS. TESS is funded by the National Science Foundation, so it will field your survey experiment for free if it is accepted. Ours, unfortunately, was not, but we do encourage people to apply. Let's come back to our question. Is a representative sample a realistic aspiration for students relying on Princeton student research grants? We find the answer is no. With $5,000, we could not afford a nationally representative recruited panel sample as we had hoped. Instead, we fielded our full survey experiment with an opt-in panel sample of 1,428 respondents. We believe the experimental design will yield insights into demographic differences in perceptions of sexual coercion, and therefore that our findings are publishable in a reputable journal, but the sample does not allow us to accurately estimate population values, limiting the external validity. We encourage future students to collect data, but to recognize the limitations of samples that they can afford on a student grant budget. Given these limitations, we recommend an experimental design as a way to gain insight on relative differences between groups as an important but not final step in building a body of research. Students doing survey experiments should collect pilot data, then apply to tests. Even unsuccessful applications get useful reviewer feedback through the application process. And as I said at the start, the Survey Research Center, and particularly Ed Freeland, are great resources, so don't hesitate to use them.